not be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Skag and skip out for beer during commercials because the revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by Xerox in 4 parts without commercial interruptions. The revolution will not show you pictures of Nixon blowing a bugle and leading a charge by John Mitchell, General Abrams, and Spyro Agnew to eat hog maws confiscated from a Harlem sanctuary. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by the Schaefer Award Theater and will not star Natalie Woods and Steve McQueen or Bullwinkle and Julia.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am ecstatic, literally ecstatic to have the guest that I have today, because you know when I do this TV Courtroom show, it's just me going on and on and on. And I'm sure you enjoy me going on and on and on, but every now and then we need to take a break and have somebody else who's an expert in his or her field. Now, you know this is called the TV Courtroom, so I often deal with issues that pertain to the law, but not just the law. We also deal with political issues, historical issues, current events, and that all comes together in the issue we're dealing with today. What is that issue? The issue pertains to Abolition Hall. You might say, Abolition Hall? What's Abolition Hall? That's exactly what I said a couple months ago when I first heard about this. And then I met a young lady by the name of Sidel Zove, and she's with a group called Friends of Abolition Hall. And then she put me in touch with people, and just recently, one of the persons she put me in touch with is our guest today. Our guest, Dr. David Contosta. Now, before we turned the cameras on and all of you folks, the millions of you watching this, I said, Dr. Contosta, please, please don't insist upon me reading the 33 pages of your bio. Please let me summarize. He said, Mike, I'll kill you if you read those 33 pages. Just get to the highlight. And I had planned to do that anyways, in all seriousness. Here's a gentleman who is a professor of history in the History and Political Science Department at the great local Chestnut Hill College. And there's so much I want to say about him, but he said, Mike, don't go into everything, but I got to tell you some stuff, because this is why. I like him, I respect him, but I really love this show, and I want the show to have credibility. So if I bring a guest on, I want you to know the background of that guest, so you then know, wow, that guy knows what he's talking about. He didn't just Google something last night. He didn't just Wikipedia something this morning. He's lived this. And you talk about somebody who's lived American history and related topics. Here's a gentleman, Dr. David Contosta, who, as I jokingly said to him again before the camera started to roll, I better get to the intro quick, because if I don't, there'll be another book you've written. First 20 books, then I saw 21 books, then 22, 23, 24. I think we're up to 24 books. So he's a scholar, and I'm talking about American history related topics. He holds a PhD in history. He's a Fulbright scholar to France. He's a visiting scholar at Cambridge University. I mean, there's so much more, but you probably think, okay, Fulbright scholar, PhD, history professor, 24 books, that's enough. Let's get to it. And we're going to get to it. At the outset, I mentioned something called Abolition Hall, and I have several questions for the good doctor, who allowed me to call him David. He's going to call me Michael, so we're going to go back and forth doing that. But I have so many questions for him about this Abolition Hall, because in my limited research, I'm hearing about this place, this building, right outside of Philadelphia, near Germantown, and there was some connection to Frederick Douglass, and some connection to the great John Brown, and some connection to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So I'm saying I need an expert. I have one. How are you today, doctor?
Very well. I'm glad to be here, Michael.
And I'm glad to have you. Let's start at the beginning. You're going to tell us exactly what Abolition Hall is, and I want you to explain that, but I guess most important, once you break that down, why is it relevant? Because I just mentioned the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, so we're talking about a long time ago. When we're talking about abolitionists, that's a long time ago. So the first question, what is Abolition Hall? And the second, how does it matter? Why is it relevant in 2018?
It's called Abolition Hall because George Corson built a second story above his carriage shed in 1856 so that abolitionists could come there and give talks. The reason he thought that was important had to do with the fact that there were anti-slavery meetings at the Plymouth Meeting House, the Quaker Meeting House across the road, and they were threatened by mobs of pro-slavery people. Now, it might surprise us, but there were a good number of pro-slavery people around here. In fact, there was a church that was burned in Norristown because of anti-slavery meetings taking place there. So George Corson wanted to protect the meeting house. He decided to build this second story above the carriage shed, and he called it Abolition Hall. And as you say, many famous abolitionists spoke there. Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which probably had more of an effect on the anti-slavery movement than anything else. Also Frederick Douglass, a large number of abolitionist speakers who are very famous were in that hall up there. We can read about this in books, we can hear about it in lectures, but to actually go to a place and stand where these people stood is a thrilling experience, but it makes it real.
And I'm so glad you mentioned making it real, because we're going to get into that in terms of how and why it's relevant. In a couple minutes, after I ask you a few more questions, we're going to show a documentary. It's about maybe 10 minutes long, and it includes much of what we're going to get into. I talked about Frederick Douglass, you talked about Harriet Beecher Stowe, we mentioned John Brown, but tell us about this connection of the Underground Railroad to this site at Abolition Hall. And by the way, where is Abolition Hall? Is it 100 miles away from Philadelphia? Where is it? And what's its connection to the Underground Railroad?
It's about 2.5 or 3 miles beyond Northwestern Avenue. So it's just above the Chestnut Hill section of Philadelphia. It is at the corner, the intersection of Germantown Avenue and Butler Pike in the village of Plymouth Meeting. So if people have taken Germantown Pike out to the Turnpike, they would have gone past those properties, although Abolition Hall is a little bit off the road. So you wouldn't notice it actually in that process of going out there.
Tell us about the site relative to the Underground Railroad.
Well, the Underground Railroad predated it, and in fact, the Underground Railroad, named such in the 1830s, operated under different guises, under different names, from as early as the late 1700s, with people helping those in bondage to escape into the North and to Canada, and I'll explain why that was necessary in just a few minutes.
Certainly.
Quakers were involved in it from the very beginning, but also members of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church, were involved in it too. So there were a number of groups that were acting independently of each other, and the term Underground Railroad is first used, I understand, about 1831, when a runaway sort of disappeared. He was going from Kentucky into Ohio and seemed to go underground. The railroad part of it, though, has to do with the fact that the railroad was the most exciting piece of technology at the time. And so they picked up the nomenclature of the railroad. So those who were helping slaves to escape were called conductors. Harriet Tubman, of course, was the most famous of those. The places where they stayed or were hidden and were cared for and were nourished and were clothed if they needed to have new clothing and were given emotional support were called the stations, interestingly enough.
Makes sense.
And the people who ran them are called the station masters. So there's all this railroad nomenclature that's associated with it. My students sometimes think that it was an underground facility like a subway.
A subway
or
system.
Something like that. But it's underground for at least 2 reasons. Because it's hidden. And because the runaways seem to disappear, as if they're almost going underground. It operated in this area because, and many people don't realize this, Delaware was a slave state. Maryland was a slave state. And it's largely in the upper South, in Kentucky, in Maryland, in Virginia, which later on becomes West Virginia, that part of it along the Ohio River, that those in bondage are escaping. They're coming from the deep, deep, deep South that would have been too far to go. So Philadelphia is very central to the Underground Railroad, with runaways coming across from Maryland in particular.
Well, Doctor, everything you said sounds great. It's a wonderful history. So what's the problem?
The problem with preserving it, or the problem
what's the
with
problem?
knowing about
The
it?
issue itself, because you talked about the history, the
Yes.
Abolition Hall, all that's great.
Yes.
So I'm sure the folks watching saying, okay, yeah, let's go see it. It's an important historical site. But there's a problem.
There's a problem with it, yes. The owners of Abolition Hall had put the property in trust many years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And the last occupant there, Nancy Corson, who was a good friend of mine,
Mm-hmm.
who died back in 2012, had a life interest in it, so that when she died, the property passed to her heirs, and it had to be divided. At least the value of the estate had to be divided,
Mm-hmm.
and that meant that the property had to be sold. So it has been sold to a developer who wants to put up 67 townhouses, I believe, on that site and an adjoining site, which he also purchased. And the design of this development is going to go up against the back of Abolition Hall. Now, the developer has said that there's going to be a little bit of open space behind, but it's actually a retention basin, and it's going to have a fence around it, and it's going to be full of water. So there's a real fear that the context of it is going to disappear, and I'd just like to speak to that
Please.
a little bit.
Please.
The abolitionists who were speaking at Abolition Hall would have looked out on those fields, and by the way, that property was farmed from the beginning of settlement around here until just a few years ago. They
Okay.
rented the land behind it
Mm-hmm.
to a local farmer, who then sold fruits and vegetables just around
Interesting.
the corner. So it has never been developed. Runaways were hidden in the cornfields. This is an experience that they
Wow.
would have had. And later on, we'll get into the artist who lived there, Thomas Hovenden. He was the son-in-law of George Corson, married George Corson's daughter, Helen, and he painted those landscapes back there. So for a number of reasons, the context of it is in danger. And one of the problems with the historic districts is that they preserve the buildings, but they do not preserve
Great point.
the land
Great point.
surrounding them, or at least they don't keep the land surrounding them from being developed. So something in addition has to be done if that is going to occur.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'm hearing from those who support the developer that you all are just making a big deal out of nothing, that it's already agreed that nothing will be done to the house. And those who like me initially were yelling about demolition were misguided. But you're saying, hey, we weren't as misguided as I thought I initially was. So this is what we're going to do. I had mentioned a couple minutes ago that there's a documentary, and our guest here, Dr. David, not just him, but it's him, Dr. David Contosta, and also a young lady who connected me with all this, Sadell Zove, and I got to give credit to Faye Anderson. So the three of these persons were instrumental in bringing me into this to try to spread the word. And that's what we're going to do. And I think we can spread the word very well with this great documentary. It's only about 9 or 10 minutes long. So we'd like you to watch this. And then as soon as we come back, you'll hear from my guest, Dr. David Contosta. He told me to call him David, but anybody who's written 24 books and is an award-winning scholar, I got to add that doctor. But let's do this. Let's watch the documentary. Please stay with us, because you're going to have some questions after you watch it, and all the answers from our guest, Dr. David Contosta. First, the video.
An Underground Railroad was a term that others put on it because they just couldn't understand where the people went. Because of these loving people, black and white, they just made people disappear. So it was a term of disappearing, not so much a term of efficiency of getting from one place to another.
It was very dangerous work because the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 levied harsh penalties. You could be fined $1,000 and jailed for 6 months if you helped a slave to escape. From Plymouth Meeting, the runaways were taken sometimes to Norristown, sometimes to Upper Dublin, from there into Bucks County, then into New Jersey, and then into New York. But they weren't free until they got to Canada, because Great Britain had abolished slavery throughout the British Empire. There were some anti-slavery meetings over at the meeting house, but some of the members of the meeting were afraid that they would be set upon by mobs. One of the meeting houses at Norristown was actually burned.
He heard abolitionists speak at the meeting house, and he was just changed. He, in a very Quakerly way, felt that turning inside him. And his brother Hiram states that it was within one night. He went from being sympathetic to saying, I need to do something.
So George Corson built a second story or second floor above his carriage shed where these abolitionist meetings could take place, and therefore the Quaker meeting would not be in danger.
Malsby Corson homestead there provided a place for slaves to come and be safe and move on and be nourished and be taken care of as needed. But he also provided a place where abolitionists could come and discuss. But they could come to a place that had hospitality in a world that was very hostile to them.
More so than any other old building, they are extraordinarily significant because of the events that occurred there and because of the people who lived there. That house has been in the same family for about 250 years, and they don't seem to have thrown anything away. It came to be called the Hovenden House because George Corson's daughter, Helen, married Thomas Hovenden. She went to France to study art, and that is where she met him. They came back to Plymouth Meeting and lived in that house, and it came to be the Hovenden House because of their fame as artists. He was an Irish immigrant, and he had grown up in a small town, really a village in Ireland, and he was very much taken by Plymouth Meeting. And in some ways, it reminded him of home.
When he painted characters in a painting, he would select models from the local people that he knew in his community. And a well-known example of that is the last moments of John Brown. And it is known that specific people in the village of Plymouth Meeting posed for that painting. He was, of course, a great history painter. His most famous picture hangs in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It's called Breaking Home Ties. It was exhibited in 1893 at the World's Columbia Exposition in Chicago, where it won all top prizes, was reproduced in printed form and disseminated across the country like the hottest thing, and probably was the most famous painting in America for a time. The setting of the painting is the Corson family house. You know, a young man leaving home to make his way in the modern world. And of course, you know, this is the time, the 1890s, where America is changing in radical ways, and young men are leaving the family farm and leaving a rural existence that had existed, you know, probably for centuries in many families' histories, and venturing into the city to start a new life and to participate in the new world. And, you know, I think it has everything to do with the sense of place that Thomas Hovenden is painting from, and, you know, that is the corner of Butler Pike and Germantown Avenue.
He also painted very sympathetic pictures of the African American families, individuals and families who lived in Plymouth Meeting. I think a lot of them lived actually at Cold Point, not too far away. He gives us really great insight into life in the late 19th century. He has a real nostalgia about this transition from a rural world into an urban industrial world. Thomas Hovenden's tragic death took place at a railroad crossing not far from the house, just up Germantown Pike. The death was announced in newspapers all over the country, including the New York Times. He was the most famous genre painter in the United States when he died. There was an intimate memorial service across the street on the corner at the house where they lived. Among those who came was Thomas Akins, whom Hovenden had replaced at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts as the painting and drawing teacher. Akins would later on teach their daughter Martha at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. Martha was a painter and sculptor, although she's best known as a sculptor. She did 2 relief tablets out at the George Washington Memorial Chapel at Valley Forge. She's best known for those. Martha also produced the bookplate for the William Jeanes Memorial Library. The family was very much involved in the creation of that library, and it's still used today. Martha died of pneumonia in 1941, and that was the end of the Hovenden line. In 1946, Livingston Corson and his wife Doris moved onto the family property. Among Livingston and Doris's children was Nancy Corson, who was born in 1920. She was the great-granddaughter of George Corson, who built Abolition Hall. When the family moved here, Nancy became very much a part of the community. She later became a member of the Plymouth Monthly Meeting. She had many friends in the community, very active in charitable functions in the community, and was much beloved. Nancy Corson never married and died in February of 2012. Her memorial service at the nearby meeting house included tributes that captured the spirit of the woman, her embrace of Quaker values, and her respect for the spark of God in all living creatures, and her abiding commitment to the preservation of the Corson family legacy.
Things change, but there is a worth to these buildings. It would be great if they could continue as a residence, because that's what they've always been, and as a farm or as an artist studio. This has been an artist studio since Hovenden was there. If that continuation of history could happen, that would be wonderful. But perhaps it is now time that these buildings find a different purpose.
Land is a very important part of the context. I would like to see the open space remain. Hovenden painted that land, painted the orchard, painted those fields, and he would have looked out on those fields from the studio, and those attending abolitionist meetings in the 1850s would have looked out on those farm fields too. So I wish ways could be found to preserve the land and preserve the buildings. Of course, some viable use would have to be found.
The complexity of history requires that you get to know people. You get to see what it was like to try to live in that point in time. Having the building to have today's purpose, continuing what occurred before, teaches us. We have a society that's very divided now. The lessons of this Plymouth Meeting community could teach us a lot on how to heal, forgive, and learn how to be with one another. That's in these buildings' history.
Wow. All I can say is wow. That was riveting. It was enlightening. It was motivating. It was inspiring. And fortunately for us, we have one of the key players in that documentary entitled History at the Crossroads, the activist and artist of Abolition Hall. Before we hear more from my guests, I want to give a big shout out to the filmmaker and producer, Patrick Dolan. Also, I mentioned her name a few times, Sidel Zove, who also was involved in producing this. And again, a big shout out to William Valerio, who heads Woodmere Museum. Let's do this because I'm sure many of you, like me, when I first saw this, I just had a whole bunch of questions. I'm going to throw it back to our guest. And for those who just tuned in, our guest today here on TV Courtroom is Dr. David Contosta. He says he wants you to call him David, so we'll call him David. But he's bigger than that. He's an award-winning professor and historian at Chestnut Hill College and a prolific author. When I say prolific, I mean prolific. 24 books. Having said that, Doctor, just give me your comments on what we just saw. What do you think are the highlights of that 10-minute documentary? What's the message you hope to relay in your part of this documentary?
I want to say I felt very privileged to be a part of the documentary, and Patrick Dolan did not receive a cent for shooting it and for editing it. And
is that right?
None of us who appeared in it received any compensation either. So
truly a labor of love.
It was a labor of love. It wasn't even a labor. It was,
wow.
It was pleasurable.
That's great. I mean, that was professionally done. I mean,
Very
the
well
fact
done.
that you had that done pro bono is just powerful. So we're going to touch on some of the information shared in that documentary, but let's go back to some of the questions that I initially wanted to ask you about. And I think the first thing I want to get to is this. What's the issue? Before the documentary, I asked, what's the problem? You talked about development. But let me play the devil's advocate for a second. The developer is saying, what are you all up in arms about? We agree that we're not going to demolish the house. You all know that it's on the National Register of Historic Places. You know all that. So with all those protections in mind, what's the problem? You touched on it a little bit, but expand upon it. If I'm playing the devil's advocate and claim that it's no big deal, we're not going to demolish the house, then it's a non-issue. What's your response?
Well, there's the context, and we talked about that a little bit before, the land behind it, the land around it, so there can be access to it, so there could be a little welcome park behind it. And we also want to have access for school children. In the past, the children at Plymouth Meeting Friends School would go across there, and this was an enlightening experience for them, a wonderful experience to them, to realize that these people 160 years or so ago risked being imprisoned, risked being fined $1,000 or 6 months in jail if they helped anybody to escape from slavery. These were very brave men and women, and they can be an example to us now. We have very serious problems about race in this country now. We have a president who said that the members of the Ku Klux Klan in Charlottesville and those protesting against them were both good folks, and that they were on the same level. He has refused to chastise Roseanne Barr for the horrible things she has said. In fact, he says ABC owes him an apology because they've criticized him. We have a situation here in Philadelphia where two black men go into a Starbucks and they're going to wait for some others to begin a meeting, and the manager calls a policeman. I've gone to Starbucks myself and in other places waiting for friends and didn't order anything, and nothing happened to me. Absolutely nothing happened to me.
Let me ask, because I noticed as I'm listening to you, you kind of went from your academic hat to your activist hat.
Right.
And you know, I have this brand that I'm the angriest black man in America, and I see that kind of anger coming out of you. Why do you care about this? What's the big deal for you?
Well, I've written a lot about what I call the American experiment, and the hypocrisy bothers me. Thomas Jefferson says all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and so on and so forth. He's a slaveholder, as we know, although he himself believed that slavery was a firebell in the night that might cause a lot of problems in this country. I want us to practice what we preach. I want us to live up to what we say we are. I want us to be an example to the world, and we can't be that so long as we have this curse of racial hatred and animosity in this country. It's counter to everything that we supposedly stand for in this country, and if we aren't treated as equals, then we're going to have continuing political and social divisions in this country, and it's just wrong. It's absolutely wrong. We're all children of God. We're all created equal. Humanity is really the same. The human condition is the same all around the world. I've done a lot of traveling. I've been to China. I've been to Japan. I just got back from the British Isles and so forth. And although there might be some superficial differences among people, they don't really amount to very much at all. The human condition really is the same. And the only way we're going to get along in this world is if we come to realize that and believe it. I think that racism is based in ignorance and in fear.
Yes.
And the ignorance and the fear go together and reinforce each other. And I'm not sure how we can break through that. There's a very wonderful woman in the church I go to, African-American woman, Rena, who's 98 years old now. And she says the only way we can break through this is if we talk to each other. And she's arranging for black people and white people to talk to each other, and she arranged for a bus to take a group down to the African American Museum in Washington, D.C. I think there are too many people, and perhaps both black people and white people, who don't really have friends.
Yeah. They're kind of isolated in their own little world.
Are members of another race. Now, I'd say about a third of the students at Chestnut Hill College, about a third of the students I teach are African American kids, and they're like any other kids.
Yep.
It's just really obvious.
Very same
They're
thing.
no different.
Doctor, what I'd like you to do is we're going to talk more about the history, but when I asked you about, hey, the developer is saying that there will be no demolition, and you're saying, well, yeah, ultimately it will be, or could be, and you talked about the area around it. Let's show, we have two photographs I want to the audience to see.
Well, I'll just better explain this. It's
Yes.
not just the context.
Please.
The developers cannot demolish the buildings. That's true.
And tell us about this HARB board.
Well, the
this-
HARB board,
okay.
Historic Architectural Review Board, that was set up, and it's set up in all of these historic districts. They have to give permission for historic buildings to be altered or demolished. They would give a certificate of approval to do that.
Okay.
And there are instances in which they or the Board of Supervisors can give permission to tear down a building if it's a matter of hardship. There are cases in which the HARB board, which is called, or the HARB, has said that a property cannot be demolished, and then they're overruled by the supervisors because they're only advisory. They're only advisory. Now, I'm not saying this is going to happen
Certainly.
to these buildings, but they could be demolished. Or there's another thing that often happens, and that's demolition through neglect. And again, I'm not saying that the developers are going to do that. But what a person might do is just let a building sit there and decay, let the roof fall in, let it be in such bad shape that then they go to the authorities and say, well, this needs to be condemned, it's dangerous, it needs to be torn down.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I've heard from those on the other side that because the site is on the National Register of Historic Places, that nothing could happen to it or the surrounding area. If we do have the photos, could you tell us what it is we're looking at here?
Yes, we're looking at a property on Germantown Pike. I think it's 15 Germantown Pike, and it's very near Abolition Hall. And this property has been vacant for many years, and it's decaying, as you can see.
Wow.
And that's a good example of what we call demolition by neglect.
That term you use is a powerful, powerful term. So let's back up a bit, Doc. Take us from the beginning. If you were giving a lecture now, and I guess we have about maybe 20 minutes left, just for the next 15 minutes or so, just run through it. Tell us the history behind this. Tell us what information we need to understand. Tell us what needs to be added to the documentary. I'm going to turn it over to you right now.
Well, I guess I would go back again to the operation of the Underground Railroad, and two things happen in this property. They have abolitionist speakers coming there, and they also are receiving runaways, and they're feeding them, and they're clothing them, and they're hiding them and giving them emotional support, and I can't even begin to imagine how terrifying it would be to leave one's home, even though it might not be a wonderful place, even though one is in slavery, not know where he or she is going, not know what it was going to be like when he or she gets there, not knowing whether he or she is going to be caught and then taken back and punished severely for having run away. They were extraordinarily brave people to attempt to do this, and I think it gives us some sense of how horrible slavery was and how much they yearned to be free.
Absolutely.
Now, they weren't free when they got across the Mason and Dixon line. That's the boundary line between Pennsylvania and Maryland, or over the Ohio River into, let's say, Ohio or Indiana or Illinois. That's where a lot of the Underground Railroad operated, in the southern part of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And it's because of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which was a part of a compromise. The United States conquered from Mexico the entire southwestern part of the United States, including California. And because of the gold rush, California has enough people to apply for statehood in 1850. The southern states are insisting again and again that they ought to have the right to take their slaves into the new territories. And they're afraid that if they can't do that, then the United States Senate is going to be controlled by northern people, and that they're going to lose their control of the US government. So this compromise is worked out whereby California comes in a free state. The United States government agrees to pick up the Texas debt. They had just been annexed by the United States. The slave trade is suppressed in the District of Columbia, and this is horrible when you think about it. Slavery was legal in Washington, D.C. because it was part of Maryland. It was carved out of Maryland. And there were slave markets within sight of the U.S. Capitol building. And Southern senators and representatives in Washington had their personal slaves come with them and sit on the steps outside the Capitol and wait for them to come out. Foreign ambassadors come to the United States and see this, and it's really despicable. So the deal is that you can't buy and sell slaves in Washington, D.C., but you can still have slaves in Washington, D.C. What the South gets out of it is the Fugitive Slave Act. And if you help a slave to escape, and we talked about this, you could be fined $1,000 and thrown in jail for 6 months. The local authorities, the local sheriff, the local police were also required to capture runaways and hold them in jail, let's say in the jail in Montgomery County or in the jail here in Philadelphia, until their owners could come back and get them. They weren't free until they got to Canada, and that's because the British government abolished slavery in 1833 throughout the entire British Empire, and Canada was a part of the British Empire. I was just in London a couple of weeks ago, and there's a wonderful monument just below the Houses of Parliament, a park. It's a beautiful Gothic revival monument to this abolition of slavery in 1833. So once they got across the Canadian border, they were safe. So from Plymouth Meeting, they would go to Upper Dublin Township, then they would go to Bucks County, then they would go into New Jersey, and then to New York, and someone can conduct them all the way up through New York into Canada. So it was a long, arduous
let me just
journey.
stop you right there. How did they keep this secret?
They kept the secret because nobody knew the names of anybody else who was involved in it. So the person up at the next station, let's say, did not know the name of the person at the station below. So he couldn't testify against anybody because he didn't know the name. So it was really secret. And that's one of the problems we have now in identifying where these Underground Railroad stops were.
See.
And out where I am, every other person who has a cistern or something says it was a stop on the Underground Railroad and they had the slaves there. And most of them, in fact, aren't authenticated. We know that this Corson property is authenticated.
Before you get back into the property itself in terms of Abolition Hall, talk a bit about the Corsons.
George Corson had a farm there at the corner of Butler Pike and Germantown Avenue. He attended the Quaker meeting diagonally across from there. He wasn't a member of it, but he attended. And some people attend a church, but they don't ever join it. So that's essentially the case. And Corson heard some abolitionists speaking about slavery, and he had a kind of a religious experience, I guess. He felt as if God had called upon him to do something about this. Or as David Miller says, who's in the video and who was one of the elders of the meeting, he had a sense of a turning inside. And George Corson believed that he had to dedicate his life to dealing with this great evil, which in fact is what he did. Wow. His daughter, Helen, and I think I mentioned her in passing.
Yes, you did.
Went to study art in Paris as a very young woman, which was, I think, a very daring thing to do. And she met a man named Thomas Hovenden there, who was from a small village in Ireland. Hovenden, in fact, had grown up during the famine in Ireland, and I think he had a sympathy for African Americans because of that, and he felt very much at home in this village of Plymouth Meeting. About the time he comes, of course, the Civil War is over. But Hovenden transforms Abolition Hall into his studio. And Hovenden, when he died in 1895, was the most famous genre painter in the United States. And by that I mean he paints everyday scenes, essentially. He painted two very famous canvases. One of them's in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and one of them's in the Metropolitan in New York. And the one in the Metropolitan New York is called The Last Moments of John Brown, where John Brown is being taken out of the courthouse. He's going to be hanged because of the raid at Harper's Ferry. His idea was to take arms and to arm the slaves so that they could rise up. And there was a lot of controversy, of course, about John Brown. Some of them saw him as a Christ-like figure. So Hovenden did this famous painting, and he used local people to pose for it. And in fact, he used local people again and again to pose for his work, for his painting. You've probably seen a representation of this. It was in the video, but it often turns up in history textbooks and so forth. He painted on the back porch of a house just down the road from Abolition Hall, and that's also in the historic district. The other famous painting that he did was called Breaking Home Ties, and it's about a young man. He looks like he's 16 or 17 years old. He's having to leave the family farm and to go into the big city because the small farms around here were undermined when the Great Plains open up and they have hundreds and hundreds of acres and so forth. They can't compete. And this was a scene that was repeated again and again and again. And it's staged in the front room of the house there on the corner of Germantown and Butler called the Hovenden House. That's where Corson lived, by the way, and his carriage shed and barn were behind that. And in the painting, you notice that the boy's mother is hugging him, but he won't look at her because he's afraid he's going to cry. He won't look at his mother. It was exhibited at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. They wore out 4 carpets in front of it because it was so spectacular. And the reason for this is so many families had been through this. The young men went off to the city. And I showed this to my students, and I said, how might that resonate with you? And they'll say, I sort of felt like that when I left for college. Or people feel like that when they have to leave home for a new job somewhere. So I think it continues to resonate.
Great point.
Because so many of us have had that kind of experience. He also painted a number of African American families and individuals who had settled in Plymouth Meeting. He used a man named Absalom Jones again and again to pose for his paintings. But he paints these individuals and families as if they're regular, normal people. I guess that's the way I would have to put it.
And I think it's important because often when you see African Americans portrayed, they're props.
Right.
But in this case, they're humanized. Let's do this before we run out of time. So you talked about the history of the house, the history of the area, the Fugitive Slave Act. Where does this issue stand now? Is it in court? Are there hearings going on? What's happening now?
What's happening now is that we're continuing to have hearings or meetings before the Board of Supervisors of White Marsh Township. And the developer has put up various experts. That's been going on for the last several months. They put up their last expert a week ago Thursday. And those of us who are involved with Friends of Abolition Hall are going to put up our experts beginning next Thursday.
Okay.
So it's probably going to go on and on and on for quite a while now.
So this White Marsh Township Board of Supervisors, in a sense, they're acting like a court, and there's a hearing going on, testimony presented, and
Yes.
that kind of thing. Just so folks know, what the good doctor is talking about is there will be a meeting on Thursday, June 14, 7 p.m., White Marsh Township Board of Supervisors. That's located at 616 Germantown Pike in Lafayette Hill, right past Chestnut Hill, right past Germantown. Once again, jot this down. Thursday, June 14, 7 p.m., White Marsh Township Board of Supervisors meeting located at 616 Germantown Pike in Lafayette Hill. And we encourage folks to show up. And if you need transportation, I'm a part of a group called ATTAC, A-T-A-C, Avenging the Ancestors Coalition, and we're working with and supporting Friends of Abolition Hall. So if you need transportation, give us a call, 215-552-8751, 215-552-8751. We have a few more minutes left, 13 more minutes left, Doctor, but I really want people to know from you, what can they do? They can certainly attend that meeting, but the reality is that this is a type of war, and you have to finance your army.
Yes.
How can people finance this army?
Well, people can contribute through our website, which is Friends of Abolition Hall. We have legal expenses that we have to pay, and the hearings are almost like a court hearing because there are objections from the attorney on the other side, and then our solicitor in White Marsh Township has to decide whether they're overruled or whether they're sustained, and the board will have to vote on that,
Certainly.
interestingly enough. So there is a lot of back and forth, the same sort of thing that you would find in a courtroom, and they're trying to make this hearing to be fair and to be professional as much as possible. So it's rather interesting to see that give and take. We're concerned that some of the evidence we want to present will not be admitted, and we want to admit evidence about stormwater runoff, about various environmental issues.
Yes.
And the developer is saying that that doesn't belong at this stage, that it belongs at a later stage. So that's something that we're going to have to fight out as time goes on. Another thing that folks can do is to call or write State Senator Vince Hughes, who's our state senator and is very sympathetic, I think, to our situation and to our cause.
I would agree. So you all have your marching orders, and I'm so glad that our producer is showing what could happen. I love what our guest here today, Dr. David Contosta, said about demolition by neglect. That's absolutely perfect. What I'd like folks to do is donate, donate, donate. And you can do that by going to the Facebook page at Plymouth Meeting Abolition Hall. If you go to Facebook, everybody has Facebook, everybody has access to social media. Go to Plymouth Meeting Abolition Hall on Facebook, follow the instructions, and donate. That's the only way an army can win the war, is if it can finance that war. So please go to Facebook, Plymouth Meeting Abolition Hall. And I know that there are some folks who might not have access to social media, and if you don't, that's not a big deal. As I mentioned before, there's a group called ATTAC, A-T-A-C, Avenging the Ancestors Coalition, and we're fully supporting Friends of Abolition Hall. So if you don't have access to social media, if you don't have access to Facebook, you do have access to a phone. Call 215-552-8751, 215-552-8751, and say, wow, I heard Dr. David Contosta talk about Abolition Hall. I heard about what could be done. I want to play a role. And it's really important that folks play a role, because think about this. Here we are today as activists trying to fight the good fight, but our lives are not in jeopardy. Our children are not in jeopardy. We're not going to be kidnapped. We're not going to be lynched. None of those, we're not going to be sold away. But those who laid the foundation for our freedom, they need our help. Their story must be told. let me do this because I've talked long enough. This is TV Courtroom, and you heard the opening statement from our guest, Dr. David Contosta. He prefers David, but anybody who's an award-winning scholar, who's a prolific author, I got to add that doctor. So at the beginning of the show, we had his opening statement. He presented his case and his evidence, and as we wind down now in the next 6 or 7 minutes, I just like the good doctor to give us a closing argument. If there's anybody in the jury, that's you out there in the public, if anybody out there in the jury, if you're still not sure, before you go into deliberate, listen to the good doctor's closing argument.
Well, before I get to that, I think another issue is that there has to be some determination about how these structures are going to be used, if they're safe.
Yes.
They're going to function as a museum. Is someone going to live there? What exactly is going to happen? And there have been various ideas which have been tossed around about that. But I guess the closing argument would be this. The past is prologue. We are where we are because of what has happened before. We are where we are because our ancestors fought the good fight. They did in the 1840s and 50s, and they did during the Civil War, and they did during the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s and 1970s, and we can't lose sight of that. I'm encouraged, as I said earlier, about the bravery of these men and women who risked their lives in some cases and who risked being imprisoned and risked being fined to carry out this work. And they did so in the midst of great hostility. Race is not just a Southern problem in this country. It's a national problem in this country. And there were many people in the area of Plymouth Meeting, and in Philadelphia for that matter, who were very angry about the abolition movement. They thought the abolitionists were troublemakers, and they were fearful about what the consequences would be. We forget about how segregated Philadelphia was. It wasn't segregated by law, but it was segregated by custom. The beaches at Atlantic City were segregated. Hotels weren't segregated by law in Philadelphia, but they were by custom. The movie theaters were segregated at one time, again through custom rather than through law. We're not there any longer, but we seem to have slipped backward just a little bit. And I don't know whether it's in reaction against President Obama.
Great point.
There's some supposition. He, in fact, himself, or at least this individual who's written a book about the Obama administration, has suggested that that's the case. So we can be inspired by what these folks did 160, 170 years ago, and to stand where they stood, to be in their midst and not just read about it in a textbook or hear someone like me run off in the mouth about it. It makes it real, it brings it home. And so for all of these reasons, this property needs to be cherished, it needs to be protected, it needs to be accessible in a way that teaches us about the past and how the past is prologue.
Well said, well said. Our guest today, Dr. David Contosta, award-winning professor, historian, prolific author, 24, 25 books. As we wrap this thing up, again, we're at war, so we need some marching orders, and here they are. 1, please reach out to State Senator Vincent Hughes. If you need his address, if you need his email, if you need any of that, just reach out to ATTAC, ATAC, Avenging the Ancestors Coalition at 215-552-8751. That's the first thing. Reach out to Senator Vincent Hughes. He has been supportive, he has been an ally, and we can rest assured that he'll continue to do the right thing because he's always done that. That's the first thing, Senator Vincent Hughes. And you can reach him by contacting ATTAC. The second thing, and I should have said this first, donate, donate, donate. We need folks to finance this army. There's an attorney who's doing a whole lot of work to get this thing done, but he has to be compensated.
Yes.
There are other folks who have been working around it who are doing volunteer work.
But he's not charging at the rate that he could either.
That I'm so glad you mentioned
important
it.
to mention.
Absolutely, he's pretty much requesting that expenses be paid, because if he really wanted to bill them, they'd essentially be bankrupt. So
Right.
you can support that effort by donating, and you can donate through Facebook at Plymouth Meeting Abolition Hall. Just go to Facebook, look up Plymouth Meeting Abolition Hall, and donate $5, $10, $25, whatever you can afford. In addition, I want to give a big shout out to Sidel Zove, a big shout out to Faye Anderson, and a big shout out to the producer, David Dolan, of that documentary you saw, History at the Crossroads, the activist and artist of Abolition Hall. Let me do this, because in a regular courtroom, when you have your closing argument, it's done. You can't add anything. But we got an expert here, and we have about 2 minutes left. I just want him to, if there's any I's that need to be dotted, any T's crossed, anything highlighted, the final 2 minutes, Doctor, are yours.
Well, we're not just talking about some old buildings 3 miles or so above Philadelphia. They are locally important, regionally important, important throughout the Commonwealth and the United States, and even internationally because
Yes.
of what they mark. We're not
Yes.
talking about just some dusty old buildings. And not everything, in fact, is going to be preserved or can be preserved. But these are places of extraordinary importance for the Underground Railroad, for the abolition movement, and for this world-famous painter
Yes.
who lived there and
Yes.
in some ways completed the work of his father-in-law with the last moments of John Brown, with the African-American families and individuals whom he painted in the neighborhood. So these structures are important for 2 reasons, 3 reasons really, and it's extraordinary. Once they're gone, they're gone. Once the context is gone, it's gone. And it's not something that can be brought back. It's not something that can be replaced. It's irreplaceable. I'm not saying that they're going to be torn down.
Certainly.
But I want some context to it. Hopefully we can broker some kind of arrangement between the developer and the Friends of Abolition Hall and the township and so forth to set aside an acre or 2 behind
Great
these
idea.
buildings so that there is that context, there is a welcome park, people can access the facility from there.
I want to thank our guest today, Dr. David Contosta. We actually have about maybe 10 seconds left. So in our final 10 seconds, let me say this. Donate, donate, donate. Please go to that Facebook page. If you don't have access to that, call us through attack at 215-552-8751. Don't forget that meeting/hearing coming up Thursday, June 14, 7 p.m., White Marsh Township Board of Supervisors, located at 616 Germantown Pike in Lafayette Hill, just a few minutes outside of Philadelphia. Unfortunately, we run out of time, but this has been a great show. It's going to be rebroadcast over and over again. Spread the word, save Abolition Hall. Thank you very much.
You will not be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Skag and skip out for beer during commercials because the revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by Xerox in 4 parts without commercial interruptions. The revolution will not show you pictures of Nixon blowing a bugle and leading a charge by John Mitchell, General Abrams, and Spyro Agnew to eat hog maws confiscated from a Harlem sanctuary. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by the Schaefer Award Theater and will not star Natalie Woods and Steve McQueen or Bullwinkle and Julia.